Ray Hollister bought the Peck farm on a Thursday in October, standing in a field at a county auction with 40 other people who were mostly there for the equipment and the land, and had no particular interest in what was in the barn. Ray had an interest in what was in the barn, not because he knew what was there, because the barn door was closed, and barns with closed doors in rural Iowa in the autumn of an auction year are either empty or not, and the auctioneer had not mentioned the barn's contents in his listing, which in Ray's experience meant one of two things: nothing worth mentioning, or something nobody had checked. Ray had driven out the week before the auction on a Tuesday afternoon and walked the property alone. The farmhouse windows were boarded. The yard had been consumed by 15 years of unchecked growth, volunteer trees, tall grass, a stand of sumac along the west fence that had no interest in remaining where it had started. The barn was in the northeast corner of the lot, leaning slightly to the east in the way that barns lean when the main post on one side has given up, which is a lean that usually precedes a collapse by somewhere between 5 and 20 years, depending on what the winters decide. He had tried the barn door, locked not with a padlock but with 40 years of settled weather and rust that had fused the latch mechanism into a single piece of iron. He had shone his flashlight through a gap in the siding boards. He had seen enough. He bid on the property and won it for $11,000 less than the assessed value, because the fields had not been worked in years, and the farmhouse required a level of attention that most buyers didn't want to provide. The barn was not in the listing. Ray drove back out the following Monday with tools and a reciprocating saw for the latch and a work lamp on a long cord, and the particular focus of a man who has looked through a gap in a barn wall and seen something that he has been thinking about for a week. If you've ever stood at a closed door and known something important was on the other side, subscribe to this channel. A new story like this one every week. None of them end the way you expect. Let me tell you what 40 years does to a John Deere Model A when nobody opens the barn door. The answer from the outside is everything you would expect. The paint goes first, not in one season but over a decade of temperature cycles, each winter contracting the metal slightly more than the summer expands it, until the paint loses its bond with the metal beneath and begins to lift and flake and eventually disappear entirely, leaving the bare iron to do what bare iron does in Iowa humidity, which is to develop the particular orange-brown rust that has its own taxonomy of textures depending on the alloy, the exposure, and the years involved. The rubber goes next, or simultaneously, the tires losing their plasticizers to UV and cold cycling, the rubber becoming first stiff and then cracked, and then something between rubber and fossil, still holding its shape in outline but no longer trustworthy as a functional material. Then the organic material arrives. Mice first, then birds, then the slow, patient colonization of moss and lichen on every flat surface that holds moisture, and the vines that enter through any gap and reach for whatever is available, which is everything. The steering wheel goes under the vines, the throttle lever, the exhaust stacks. The whole machine becomes a substrate for the biology of a building that has given up trying to keep nature out. That is what the outside of the 1950 John Deere Model A looked like when Ray Hollister finally got the barn door open on a Monday morning in October. The inside of the engine was a different story. But Ray didn't know that yet. The barn was larger than it had appeared through the gap in the siding. The collapsed section of roof was on the west end, which meant the east end, where the Model A was parked, had been relatively protected from direct rain, though not from the humidity that moves through a building like water moves through soil, finding everything. Multiple shafts of pale green-tinted light entered through the roof gaps and the wall cracks, illuminating the barn dust that Ray's entry had disturbed into long, slow columns of floating particles that moved like something alive. The Model A was under things. Not catastrophically, no full hayloft collapse, no fallen main beam, but the accumulated drift of 40 years of a building shedding itself inward. Fallen insulation from the roof, rotted boards from the wall lining, hay dust that had compacted over decades into something with the texture of old felt, and the vines, which had been the most industrious of all the arrivals and had made the most thorough claim on the machine's upper surfaces. Ray began clearing from the front, working methodically toward the rear, the way a carpenter works a site, identifying what can be moved and moving it, identifying what needs to be cut and cutting it, leaving nothing for later that can be done now. He worked for 4 hours on Monday and 3 more on Tuesday, and by Tuesday afternoon, he had the tractor clear enough to walk around and assess. He assessed it the way a man who works with materials assesses things, by looking at what the material was designed to do and asking whether it could still do it. The answer for most of the Model A's external surfaces was no. The paint was gone, the rubber was compromised, the seat was destroyed, the vines would need cutting from the steering wheel spokes before the wheel could be tested for function. The battery, if there had been one, was long beyond use, though the Model A's hand crank start meant the battery was not essential for operation. Then Ray found the toolbox. It was under the seat pan, in the space between the seat mounting and the drawbar, a standard location for letter series John Deere tool storage, though Ray didn't know that. He found it because he lifted the seat pan to check the frame below for rust damage, and the seat pan came up easily, and there was the tool box, and in the tool box was a small envelope, and in the envelope were 2 paper receipts and a folded note. The first receipt, gasoline 12 gallons, December 14, 1982, from a service station in Marshalltown, Iowa. The second receipt, SAE 30 engine oil 2 quarts and a box of spark plugs, same date, same station. The note in a hand that wrote carefully and with some effort, the hand of a man for whom writing was not easy, tank full, oil changed, cylinders oiled, timing set, ready. Ray read the note twice. He looked at the dates on the receipts. December 14, 1982. He did not know yet when Howard Peck had died. He would find out later that it was February 3, 1983, 7 weeks after the date on the receipts. He would find out that Howard had known he was dying for most of the autumn of 1982, and that he had continued to do his work in the way he had always done his work, carefully, completely, and without leaving things unfinished for someone else to find. A man who knew he was leaving had gone to the service station in Marshalltown and bought gasoline and oil and spark plugs and had come back to the barn and done the winter shutdown on the Model A the way you do a winter shutdown on a machine you expect to have running again in the spring. Except Howard Peck was not going to have it running in the spring. He was doing it for whoever would. Ray sat on the barn floor for a while with the receipts in his hand. He called the county assessor's office to find the last owner of record. The assessor gave him a name, Gerald Peck, Des Moines, who had inherited the property from his mother Agnes and had been paying the taxes on it from a distance for 20 years without returning. Ray called the number in the county records. Gerald Peck answered on the 3rd ring. "I bought the Peck farm at auction last week," Ray said. "I'm working on the barn. There's a John Deere Model A in here." There was a silence on the line. "I know," Gerald said. "Your father's." "Yes." "The engine was prepared," Ray said, "before he died. Fuel, oil, cylinders. It's been sitting 40 years, but it was prepped properly before it sat." Another silence, longer. "He never told me that," Gerald said. "I thought you might want to be here when I try to start it," Ray said. Gerald drove 3 hours from Des Moines the following Saturday. He arrived in a plain jacket and khaki trousers, city shoes that were not suited for a barn floor, and an expression that Ray recognized as the expression of someone who has driven 3 hours towards something they are not sure they can handle and have driven the whole way anyway. He stood in the barn doorway for a long moment before he came inside. He walked to the Model A and put his hand on the rusted hood. He didn't say anything. "I remember when this was green," Gerald said finally. "What color were the wheels?" "Yellow," Gerald said. "Bright yellow, he kept them clean." He stood there with his hand on the mossy hood. Around him the barn held its atmosphere, the green light shafts, the floating dust, the deep shadows in the corners where 40 years of accumulation had solidified into something permanent. "He loved this machine," Gerald said. "He talked about it the way some men talk about their children. I never understood it." "Do you now?" Gerald looked at the tractor. "I'm starting to." Ray had done the preparation over the previous 3 days, following Howard Peck's own instructions, the margin notes in the original owner's manual that had been in the toolbox alongside the receipts. Howard had written in pencil, in the careful hand of a man who took instructions seriously: carburetor needle position for first start after storage, timing verification procedure, the number of slow hand rotations to work oil through the cylinders before the first crank attempt. Howard had written these notes for himself, for his own reference across the years of owning the machine, but they served now as instruction for a man who had never started a two-cylinder John Deere, left by a man who had started this particular two-cylinder John Deere hundreds of times, and who had, at the end, prepared it to be started one more time by someone he would never meet. Ray checked the fuel line. He verified the carburetor needle position against Howard's note, 2 turns from seated, exactly. He set the timing mark on the flywheel to the position indicated in the manual and confirmed by a second pencil note from Howard in the margin. Small scratch mark on flywheel, aligned to pointer. Don't overthink it. He did not overthink it. He found the hand crank in the toolbox, original, heavy, still functional. He set it in the front casting at the position that Howard's note described. Thumb up, 12 o'clock, compression just passed. Gerald stood back. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. His face said, "I have driven 3 hours for this, and I have prepared myself for nothing to happen, and I am ready." Ray pulled. The flywheel turned. The piston found its compression. The crank came through cleanly. Pop. One combustion, clean, definite. The barn was silent for a moment after the sound. Then Ray set the crank again. He pulled. Pop. And then on the third pull, the engine caught and did not stop. Pop, pop, pop. 2 cylinders at low RPM, the exhaust rising from the dual stacks in 2 parallel lines of gray smoke that went up into the green barn light and found the roof gaps and escaped into the October air. The barn dust moved in the engine currents. The cobwebs between the stacks shuddered. The 40 years of silence ended in a sound that Howard Peck had last heard in November of 1982 when he shut the tractor down for the final time and walked back to the farmhouse in the dark. Ray stood at the front of the tractor with the crank still in his hand, not moving. Gerald Peck sat down. Not slowly, he sat down the way a man sits down when his legs have made a decision his mind hasn't yet caught up to, finding the barn floor against the wall, knees up, one hand over his mouth. He was not crying. He was listening. He knew, Gerald said. His voice was level and quiet. He knew someone would come. He made sure it would start. Ray looked at the running engine, the flywheel turning at low RPM, the sound even and authoritative, the same sound it had made in 1949 when Howard had driven it off the truck for the first time, and in 1952 and in 1967, and in the last autumn of 1982 when a dying man had gone to the service station and come back with fresh gasoline and done the work one final time. He didn't leave it for whoever found it, Ray said. He left it ready. That's different. Gerald looked at the tractor for a long time. That was my father, he said. He didn't leave things half done. Gerald Peck called his mother that evening from the farmhouse steps. Agnes Peck was 89 years old and living in a care facility in Marshalltown, and her memory was partial and selective in the way that memories become at 89, keeping some things with perfect clarity and releasing others entirely. Howard had been gone for 40 years, and Agnes remembered him with the thoroughness of someone who had been paying attention for 50 years of marriage. Gerald told her about the tractor, about the receipts, about December 14, 1982. Agnes was quiet for a moment. "He went to town that day," she said. "I remember. He didn't tell me what for. He came home and went to the barn and I could hear him working. He was in there for 2 hours. Why didn't he tell you?" "He didn't want me to worry," Agnes said. "He didn't want me to think about after." Gerald sat on the farmhouse steps and looked at the barn. "He was getting the tractor ready for someone," Gerald said. "He must have known someone would come back for it." "Howard always said," Agnes told him, "that a good machine doesn't die. It just waits for the right person." She paused. "He said John Deere built them that way on purpose." The 1950 John Deere Model A spent that winter in Gerald Peck's garage in Des Moines, which was not a barn and was not Iowa farmland but was warm and had good light. And Gerald spent that winter learning the machine the way a man learns something late in life, not from necessity, but from the desire to understand something he should have understood earlier. He rebuilt the carburetor. He replaced the rubber fuel lines. He had the valve seats cut by a machinist in Ames who had worked on letter series John Deere's for 30 years, and who told Gerald that the engine was in remarkable condition for its age, and Gerald said he thought he knew why. In the spring, Gerald drove the Model A back to the Peck farm, his father's farm, Ray Hollister's land now, and asked Ray if he could take it through the field one time. Ray opened the gate. Gerald drove the Model A across the east field at 6 miles an hour, the engine popping at its slow, patient cadence, the dual exhaust stacks leaving their parallel lines of gray smoke in the April morning air. He drove the length of the field and back. He parked it by the barn. He sat on the seat for a moment after shutting it down. Then he climbed off and closed the barn door behind him. Not locked this time, just closed. Ray Hollister still owns the Peck farm. He has rebuilt the farmhouse and works as a carpenter from the property. The 1950 John Deere Model A is in the barn where Howard Peck parked it in November of 1982. Ray runs it twice a month. Not for field work, for the same reason Howard ran it twice a month in the years before he died. Because a machine that is run stays ready. Because the seals stay seated, and the fuel moves and the oil distributes and the engine remembers what it is. On the wall of the barn, Ray has mounted the 2 receipts from the Marshalltown service station, dated December 14, 1982, in a small frame beside the toolbox where he found them. Next to them, Howard's note in its careful handwriting. "Tank full, oil changed, cylinders oiled, timing set, ready." Plop, plop, plop. 2 cylinders, 40 years of waiting, the first pull. Howard Peck did not leave things half done. He never had. And the machine he left behind carried that fact in its fuel tank and its cylinders and the receipts in the toolbox, waiting for 40 years for someone to open the barn door and find out. The engine fired on the first crank because Howard Peck made sure it would. That is what it looks like when a man does his work all the way to the end. Plop, plop, plop. 2 cylinders, low and slow, ready. The 2-cylinder era at John Deere ended officially in 1960 when the company moved on to 4 and 6 cylinders, and the industry followed. The new machines were better for most things. Progress doesn't stop to explain itself. But on December 14, 1982, in a barn in Iowa, a dying man filled a tank with 12 gallons of fresh gasoline and changed the oil and oiled the cylinders and set the timing and wrote a note that said ready. And then he walked back to the farmhouse. He was right. It was